Understanding Paul's use of the Cretan saying in Titus 1 verses 12 to 13. Titus 1 verses 5 to 16. For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you, namely, if any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion. For the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled. Holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. For there are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach, for the sake of sordid gain. One of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true. For this reason reprove them severely, so that they may be sound in the faith, not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but both their mind and their conscience are defiled. They profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny Him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed. Paul's letter to Titus guides him in appointing godly leaders for the churches in Crete. In verse 12, Paul quotes a saying, one of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. The traditional misreading is that people assume Paul agrees with this saying to describe Cretans as a whole, but that's not what he's doing. In Titus 1 verses 10 to 16, Paul identifies a specific group, rebellious believers, who are deceiving believers and disrupting the church. In verse 10, Paul introduces the group he's addressing. Paul's focus is not on Cretans as a whole, he targets a specific group of rebellious, deceptive believers, some of whom are Jewish, the circumcision group. One of the strongest proofs that Paul never shifts his focus to Cretans as a whole is his consistent use of pronouns. In verse 10, for there are many rebellious men, there are many, introduces this group. In verse 11, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families. The pronoun they continues, referring to the same rebellious people from verse 10. In verse 12, when Paul quotes the saying, Cretans are always liars, he connects it to one of themselves, a prophet of their own. Themselves and there still links back to verse 10's rebellious group, not Cretans as a whole. The pronoun themselves can only refer what he has mentioned earlier in the letter and not all Cretans that he has not mentioned. In verse 13, this testimony is true. For this reason reprove them severely, so that they will be sound. The pronoun them and they again refer to the group mentioned in verse 10, especially those influenced by Jewish myths, which wouldn't apply to Cretans as a whole. Paul never broadens his focus to condemn all Cretans, he continues addressing the rebellious believers from verse 10. The real purpose. Paul isn't endorsing the saying. He's showing that the existence of such a saying is evidence of how corrupt the false teachers are, because they repeat or believe such a slanderous, rebellious statement. The saying itself reflects their rebellious nature, proving Paul's earlier description of them in verse 10 is correct. The word testimony in verse 13 in Greek means witness or evidence given. It's not just a saying. Paul isn't agreeing with the content of the saying, he's calling the saying a true reflection of the rebellious people's corrupt mindset. Paul is saying the saying itself serves as a testimony against those people in verse 10, not that the content is factually true. Paul never switches topics. He keeps describing the same group of believers in verse 10. Verse 14 clearly targets the Jewish-influenced believers Paul mentioned earlier, not Cretans generally. In verse 15, Paul describes the rebellious believers' inner corruption. Verse 16, Paul wrote they profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny Him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed. The pronoun they continues to point back to verse 10's rebellious group of believers, not Cretans as a whole. Paul never condemns all Cretans. His consistent use of pronouns they, them, proves he's still focused on the rebellious group of believers from verse 10. The saying is quoted as a testimony against the rebellious group, not used as a blanket statement about Cretans. How does the saying in verse 12 show that the believers mentioned in verse 10 are rebellious, empty talkers, and deceivers? The saying in verse 12 is rebellious in nature, as it promotes division between Cretan and non-Cretan believers and slanders an entire group of Cretan believers. Rather than fostering unity among all believers in Christ, this type of teaching undermines it. The saying is empty talk, lacking any revelation of Jesus Christ. This kind of saying is harmful and deceiving. It unfairly targets a group of people and causes division in Christians' families. It doesn't belong in the message of the gospel. Although this saying may have been a popular belief at the time, possibly quoted by a well-known non-Christian Cretan poet too, Paul makes it clear that such sayings has no place in the church. Why are the men in verse 10 believers? Paul's letter to Titus is focused on appointing leaders in the church, a task that only involves believers. There's no need to address non-believers in this process. The men in verse 10 are at least professing Christians. Verse 13 supports this: reprove them severely so that they may be sound in the faith. If they were unbelievers, they wouldn't be unsound in the faith. They would have no faith at all. You can't correct someone to be sound in something they don't believe in to begin with. This correction only makes sense for those already inside the faith community, though misguided or deceived. Clearly, these men are part of the church. Paul's goal is to help Titus appoint good and strong leaders for the church. He uses the rebellious group of believers' own kind of slanderous statements as evidence of their corrupt mindset, not as a condemnation of Cretans. He is telling Titus that these believers are not suitable to be leaders. I hope this message has been helpful to you. Thank you for watching, and may Jesus bless you.